Ladies and gentlemen, now it's the time to commence the first debate, the first panel. Behind our eastern border there is the war, and throughout the world there are forces of citizens and governments who are to show their support to Ukraine and to support the Ukrainians. In the first debate, we will be looking at the EU, and we will run into the future to consider how will we organize ourselves after the end of the war. So the guests of Piotr Buras will include Timothy Garton Ash, British historian, a professor of European Studies at the University of Oxford, Sylvie Kauffmann, who is a French journalist of Agence France-Presse and newspaper and Monde newspaper, and Rafał Trzaskowski, who is mayor of Warsaw, political scientist and a specialist in European affairs. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to welcome you warmly on behalf of the European Council. We are on foreign relations. We are very happy that we are the partner of the Freedom Games and that we can host this debate. I am very happy to welcome the members of our European Council on Foreign Relations, but especially I am very happy that I can welcome you to the debate on a very difficult topic. Looking into the future maybe is not a task for optimists. The question about the European Union after the war, it's with a question mark. So we are asking ourselves that we can look into the future to so far away while we are in the middle of this dramatic conflict. There are many more questions. For example, a question on the nature of the war, to what extent this is our war. We have heard a lot about values that are under risk, that Russia is attacking the liberal democracy and Europe. And all the time we are saying that we are not a part of the war, of this war, that we are standing a bit aside as the West, as NATO and the European Union. So it is one of the questions we can think of when we are thinking of the European Union after the war. So I would like to start the discussion with a question to Timothy Garton Ash. I would like to ask you about your initial assessment where Europe is right now after the 7 months of the war, because I think that the EU is associated with the project of peace, that in Europe here we believe in globalization, integration, codependence, that all these factors develop stability and security. We believe that our values are strong and attractive also to others. So, from this perspective, the war is quite an exceptional feeling. So, what have we learned about ourselves and our self-image? How has it changed, or it should help?
Europe and contemporary Europe for me is two overlapping periods: post-war, post-1945, and what I call post-wall Europe, that is since the fall of the Berlin Wall. And in a curious way, now we're back to the largest war in Europe since 1945, so there's a going back. For the Ukrainians, post-war will be after this war, not after 1945. And what we've discovered, I think, is the end of the illusions of the post-wall period, the post-1989 period. The illusion that we have a Europe without war. I mean, despite the fact we had 5 wars in former Yugoslavia, Georgia, and then war in Ukraine since 2014, many Europeans have lived with the illusion that we had no war in Europe. The illusion that we could slash our defense spending, we weren't going to have a major interstate war in Europe, So we'd have different kinds of security. The illusion that it was all about the economy. By the way, actually, populism started destroying that illusion, because in populism it wasn't its economy stupid, it was its culture stupid. But this finally destroys that illusion. The illusion that interdependence is necessarily going to enhance our security. So it's fine to go on building up our energy dependence from Russia. Amazingly, Angela Merkel, speaking yesterday, still hasn't acknowledged that it was a huge mistake to increase Germany's energy dependence from Russia after 2014. But one other illusion, which I think, Piotr, is really important. The illusion that the largest remaining empire in Europe, namely the Russian Empire, would just softly and suddenly vanish away, and there wouldn't be a fight back. Historians could have told you that that's not what empires do. Empires fight back against the loss of empire. Ask the British, Kenya. Ask the French, if I may say so, Sylvie, Algeria. Ask the Portuguese, Angola and Mozambique. So we should have expected the empire to strike back and not have thought that we were out of the woods. It's very interesting that the guy who is now in charge of Russian forces in Ukraine participated in the putsch in August 1991. And in a way, what we're getting now is what would have happened if the putsch had succeeded in August 1991, the empire striking back. So in that sense, I think this really ends both those overlapping periods, the post-war period and the post-wall period. Very quickly, what lessons do we draw? Well, the lessons speak for themselves from what I've just said. We need to pay attention to the military again. We need to help Ukraine to win the war and Putin to lose the war. Let's be absolutely clear about that. We also need to help Ukraine to win the peace. And that may be a whole lot more difficult if you think of the economic and social condition to which Ukraine has been reduced. And then, last sentence, we need to set out to create, for the first time ever in European history, a genuinely post-imperial Europe. A Europe in which, for the first time, there are no empires abroad or at home. And for me, the centerpiece of that is the strategic goal of an enlargement of the European Union, both to Southeastern Europe and now also to Eastern Europe. And that's, for me, the agenda for the next 30 years.
Dziękuję bardzo. Ja do kwestii
I would like to stay with the European Union about the crisis and the war. The question to Sylvie Kauffmann: it is not the first serious conflict or crisis that has shaken Europe in the past 10, 15 years. We had a number of crises many said would bring the EU to collapse. We spoke about Euro crisis, migration crisis, the Brexit was a dramatic experience that was a forecast, supposed to be a forecast of EU collapse. But as Timothy Garton Ash says, we may say that this crisis is exceptional. Tim mentioned the cracking of illusions that certain foundations collapsed of our worldview. And from this perspective, I need to ask you how far the European Union as an institution, organization, faced the challenge, or did it face or not? If the crisis is so deep, how do we assess what the EU has been doing in the past 7 months?
And good evening. It's great to be in this magnificent place with all of you here in Poland and in Łódź. You know this. You've mentioned several of these crises we've been through in this century as European Union, and you know this famous saying from Jean Monnet, one of the founders of the EU, that the EU only grows through crisis. And through most of these crises that you've mentioned, the EU has grown as a more integrated institution, and probably the exception being the migration crisis, the refugee crisis. But if you look at the Euro crisis, as painful as it was, it has strengthened the economic and financial institutions of the EU. COVID-19, of course, has allowed the Commission and the Member States to decide to set this enormous recovery plan, which was really a big step ahead in terms of integration. And this war, of course, is another kind of challenge. But I think if you ask the question, has the EU met the challenge? Of course, we're not done yet, and I'm afraid all the prospect is that it's going to last for some time. We'll have to face this challenge for more time, and it will probably become tougher and tougher. But so far, I think it has brought us closer together, actually, as Brexit did. In a different kind of crisis. But we have managed to keep the unity so far. I think the decisions which were taken at the beginning about the sanctions were taken very quickly, very fast, and they were strong. They were stronger than they had ever been before. Russia was a very divisive issue, and again, this unity has been maintained. I think one spectacular thing also is this European Peace Facility, which is something which had been created to fight terrorism, to help Africa, and so on. And suddenly we found, these people in Brussels found that this could be used to reimburse member states who deliver weapons to Ukraine. So the European Union project born, to make peace, is now paying its member states to deliver weapons to a country at war. So I think this is also a major step, and the European Peace Facility, this arm, has already spent 2.5 billion euros reimbursing member states for the weapons they have delivered to Ukraine, and they now want to go up to 3 billion. So I think that's something which is already visible. I think the President of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, has also been stronger. She went 3 times to Kiev. She has pushed this case. She has really pushed the case to give candidacy status to Ukraine and Moldova. So I think that was also a major step. And then we have 2 other challenges that we are facing right now, and it's the energy challenge, but also, if you look at it, in 7 months, we've passed from a dependency rate of 41% of dependency from Russia, in gas dependency from Russia, to 7.5%. So that's also, I think, an achievement. Now we have to preserve the unity on further steps on the energy strategy, but I think we've already come some way. And finally, we are I think the major challenge we are still facing is this weapons delivery, because of course all member states are not delivering the same quantity of weapons, and we probably will talk about it later, but 2 big member states are being criticized for not delivering enough weapons. So we have still quite a way to go on this field.
Dziękuję bardzo, Sylwii. Rafał, ty
Thank you very much. Rafał, you've been watching the war, observing the war and the role of the EU from two perspectives. You are a practitioner who deals with problems related to the conflict on a daily basis. You have about 250,000 Ukrainian refugees in Warsaw and its neighborhoods, but you are also a specialist on European integration, and I've just learned that you've been teaching European integration for 25 years to students. What are your conclusions after 6-7 months? Have you learned anything about the EU in the past 6 months? Has anything surprised you? Has anything confirmed your views? What are your lessons? Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Well, I haven't been an expert for a long time. That's a pretty interesting experience to get back to old times. I'm happy to be on the stage with Timothy Ash and Sylvie. When I read the best book about solidarity written by Timothy, then I wouldn't ever believe I would stay on one stage with him, just like I learned French to stay with a French journalist on stage. Well, we can learn a lot about the European Union today, and we can observe certain trends. Sylvie has quoted that EU or European integration grows in crises. Alas, there are too many of those, and they are so deep that they can indeed strengthen the EU or kill it. Starting from the financial crisis that the EU has coped with to some extent, then there was the pandemic, that the EU wasn't ready for it. It had no prerogatives in that area. Remember purchasing vaccinations, solving problems together. The EU was not ready for that. It was far from easy. Now we have another crisis, this terrible war behind our eastern border, the refugee crisis, to which the EU was prepared somehow because of 2015-2016, although by the EU law, these are not refugees. Different regulations apply here, and obviously the energy crisis. So crises are multiple. The energy crisis, for which the EU would be absolutely not prepared, be it not for Polish attempts to pay attention to that. In 2004, we started to talk about establishing energy union. I remember the Germans at that time who were trying to block the project for many years. They didn't want to consent to joint purchases for many years, and that was a great mistake. They became dependent on Russia and treated Russia as a regular business partner. What comes out of that? The EU nature is changing. The European Union is like a miracle. The method invented in the 1950s to integrate bottom-up, where we have this strong community factor, not just international factor, that creates certain balance between institutions. We had experts who didn't only think in national categories, they think about the interest of whole union. And we had the states that made decision and the European Parliament growing in power. That balance is shaking today. In most crises, this intergovernment factor, well, member states wanted to solve the problems on their own. And we come to the next crisis that we haven't mentioned yet, the growing populism. The total growth of populism, which translates into many European countries with political parties that negate the EU or believe that the EU should be or is a regular international organization. just like in Poland. It is not just misunderstanding. It is not using the EU as a scapegoat, and we know how it ended in the UK, but that is also an attempt to destroy the system that is operating today and an attempt to turn the EU as an intergovernmental organization. Have a look at the discussion between populist parties. They say that union, strange union, is imposing something as if we were not a party to it. That's the question. Will the EU live through the crisis? Is it ready to face this crisis and many others you've just mentioned? So far, it's been coping pretty well with what we've discussed. It is united. It reacts quickly. But the cost of this war shall be incurred by citizens in the weeks to come. Will the EU stand? Will the states keep their strong position? It's unknown. We will see in the weeks to come whether the EU and member states will face the responsibility and pay the cost. That is the greatest test you can ever imagine. And the final thought, following the second hat on my head, is that the EU is not ready to cope with populism. It's not, the EU mechanism do not allow for it. And today, local authorities are on the front line of solving all the crises, being the pandemic, being the refugee issues, where all the responsibility is left with local authorities, and the EU doesn't have a strategy. Poland doesn't want one. Is not asking the EU to get a strategy. And the energy crisis today, all of a sudden, we see that it's local authorities to cope with it. A simple recipe, slight direct financing for local authorities to run joint projects would solve several problems at a time, help us in the front line of the crisis, and solve the populism problem. We are schizophrenic today. Money for Poland is locked, and it's the money that Poland needs. Otherwise, we'll be economic museum. We want the EU to be harsh on rules. But on the other hand, why should we all pay the bill for that? It would be good if money was transferred in small portions directly to local authorities, and then we will instantly see the added value of the EU. And that is the great test. Will EU be able to think innovatively as the situation demands, also in terms of the budget that will not be enough to cope with the challenges ahead? We cannot be told that we need to solve the refugee problems with the left money, or with the money planned for spending with the energy crisis. Either EU member states find extra money, or we can't cope with the crisis.
Two questions concerning your intervention. It sounds very reasonable, your idea that the EU should provide funding to local governments, provide funding to the levels that are responsible for the refugees. And secondly, you have said that the EU should find more money, should have a strategy on refugees. So do you think that this crisis should make the integration stronger? Do we need more European Union? Is this the answer? Or maybe it's more balance? The first question. There are mechanisms, thanks to our initiatives, that some money, little money is provided. For instance, this 100 green cities, it's the initiative by Franz Timmermans. So there is a mechanism, but we need to find some money to develop these initiatives. When we're talking about the deeper integrations, I don't like dogmates. We have to draw conclusions from Brexit. The EU shouldn't be dealing with all the areas. Some areas have to have more integration. For example, when we're talking about the green agenda or the issues concerning refugees or health, where European Union has to help. We have to consider whether EU maybe is over-regulated in some areas, and in some areas we really need very deep integration. So we need to draw some conclusions. We mustn't just say that the Union should be integrated in all aspects. It won't lead us anywhere. Let's stay with this theme. We are talking about the war and the consequences for the EU. It's one of the key questions about the future for integration. Tim, if I can ask you for your reflection. We are discussing the European super state. Can you see these tendencies? Do you perceive such tendencies at all? Or other facts that respond to the problems addressed by Rafał, or maybe it's rather something invented by the critics of the European Union.
Exchange about the famous Jean Monnet principle that the European Union advances through crises. Crises strengthen the European Union except when they don't. Some do, some don't. I came this morning from Budapest. We have a full member state of the European Union which is no longer a democracy, and whose head of government is going off to Moscow, meeting with Putin to secure his own energy needs, and launching frontal criticism of the EU sanctions. That's a crisis that didn't strengthen the European Union. We have a Polish government which, in this situation, is launching a grotesque anti-German campaign. Jarosław Kaczyński, Unia Europejska bez maski to są Niemcy. An absurd position to take. We have in Italy a post-neo-fascist head of government with two coalition partners who have spoken in extremely positive terms about Vladimir Putin. So, you know, some crises do, but some crises don't. And now, as Rafał rightly said, we're going into an incredibly tough winter with the economic consequences both of COVID and of the war in Ukraine, producing very high inflation, cost of living crisis, most probably a recession, certainly in many parts of the European Union. Bad times are good for populists. So I agree very much with Rafał. We should not underestimate the degree of the challenge we face. Now, to your question, Piotr, my view is this. Vladimir Putin has, in a way, gifted us a new strategic agenda for the European Union. I met Olaf Scholz, one of Olaf Scholz's right-hand men, closest advisors, 3 days before the 24th of February. And I asked him about Scholz's attitude to EU enlargement, and he said, Scholz's view is the Western Balkans, but nothing more. That's it. That's the end of EU enlargement. 4 months later, Olaf Scholz is in Kiev saying, I very much support the candidacy of Ukraine. 6 months later, he's in Prague, giving, in my view, a very good speech in which he says, we need a strategy for enlargement to the Western Balkans, Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia. And in order to do that without destroying the European Union, we need more deepening of the European Union. So that, for example, Viktor Orban cannot block another round of sanctions or another decision about Vladimir Putin. So there is a really powerful strategic logic which, as in the 1990s, connects widening and deepening. And I think that's very good news for the European Union, because it actually gives you a major new impulse, a major new direction, where the rationale for deepening is not just we always need more Europe, which is what Brussels is always inclined to say. That's not good news. There the Eurosceptics have a point, but we actually need it because we are pursuing a vision of a post-imperial Europe, a Europe genuinely whole and free.
Dziękuję, Tim. Sylwii, ty napisałaś...
Thank you, Tim. several weeks ago, you wrote a text in Financial Times. It was quite popular in Europe. Le Monde also has commented upon this paper. You were writing about the politics, European politics, moving towards the East as a result of the war. So your thesis is that Western Europe has dominated in the process of integration. Now, as a result of the war in Ukraine, as a result of the attitude of the Central Eastern Europe, now the focus is moving to the East. So I would like you to explain how you perceive, how this transformation is manifesting itself, and whether this process is durable, whether this process is only related with this conflict. And hopefully this conflict will be over soon and the transformation will be complete. And do you think that it will mean a permanent transformation for the European Union?
Timothy has mentioned this dimension of this imperial war and the fact that it's another stage in the breakup of the Russian Empire. So I think I totally agree, and I think Europe will not be the same after this, when this war ends. Whenever it ends and however it ends, and I hope it ends well. And I think it will end well for Ukraine and for us. But I think the EU and Europe will be completely different. As you said, for decades, the engine of Europe, in fact, of the European Union, was geographically situated in the West, or let's say Germany, northern France, what we call Benelux, Brussels, Netherlands, Luxembourg, and northern Italy. And that was really the economic engine, but also, I think, the political engine of the EU. Now, with Europe enlarging to the east, and with this very, very powerful dynamic given by the war in Ukraine and by the behavior of the Ukrainians, I have to say, this is also, the lesson they are teaching to all of us. Not only by their fight and the way they are waging this war and they're defending themselves, but also by the attachment to democracy and freedom that they are showing. So I think this is really a very powerful political movement in the East. Now, from the East, and since we are going to negotiate their accession to the EU, that will be this. That's why I say the center of gravity is probably going to move east. And we already see it. And so the Franco-German tandem, or couple, or whatever you call it, which was also this engine within this geographical zone, will still stay strong, I think, because these are still the two biggest countries in Europe. But you can see that politically they are on the defensive. They are put on the defensive by this new situation because they didn't plan this, they didn't listen to the Eastern and Central European countries, which were warning them for decades also, for the past 30 years, let's say, that they would have to pay much more attention. You mentioned the more attention to Russia and to Russia's goals. You mentioned the project of the energy union, which, so they have to regain their footing. I think they will regain their footing only in a very strong partnership with those Central European countries. Now, there is Poland. Poland has obviously a very crucial role to play in this future Europe, however it looks like. But how is it going to play it? We don't know, because there is a contradiction now, I think, in Poland's role, which is that it needs a more integrated Europe to fight, to help Ukraine, so that we all win this challenge together. But at the same time, politically, domestically, it's acting against this integration. You know, it wants a different Europe. It wants an intergovernmental Europe. It wants, so how is Poland going to overcome this contradiction? I think Poland has a huge opportunity now to regain a crucial role in Europe, you know, to be a real important actor and player in this new configuration, if the center of gravity does move to the east. So I just hope it's not going to waste this opportunity.
Dziękuję bardzo i oczywiście.
Thank you very much. Rafał would like to react to that. I have a question. I'm not fully convinced that the shift of the EU decision-making center or integration center to the east is permanent. I believe there is an opportunity. And the question to Rafał, how to use that opportunity? Because paradoxically, I would say you may disagree that Poland today is on the EU arena potentially as strong as never before, that our potential is so huge. What can we do with it? Well, potentially it is, but it is not, because of what our government is doing. Let's begin from saying that I do not know whether that shift eastwards is a fact. Potentially, indeed, Poland, following what is happening in the EU in respect of Brexit, then there is no strong German leadership, that the French-German engine that we speak of doesn't work as smoothly as it used to. Potentially, Poland could play a far more important role, but not with this government. One more essential comment. Sylvie says, and it's always frequently interpreted, that peace wants an intergovernmental union, but if the EU is intergovernmental fully, it would be managed by strong governments, and peace is afraid of that. So the balance of strong EU institutions and community institutions that think about shared interests make it EU not managed by one or two member states. I will opt for a thesis that even if it was purely intergovernmental union, we would have no energy union. It was the alliance between some governments and the EU Commission resulted in energy union. So we want balanced union, not state-managed. But there is an issue with expansion. The key problem with expanding the EU is that EU promised membership to Ukraine. I'm happy about it. The point is, will it be able to fulfill the promise? The Western Balkan states were promised membership in 2003 during the Saloniki summit. 20 years have lapsed almost. There is no membership. The question is, will the EU be ready to admit Ukraine quickly in foreseeable future? It's not year 2 or 5, but not 20 or 50. Will it be able to sustain that great effort, financial, geopolitical? Because if we accept Ukraine and the EU, that means the EU would need to take far more responsibility in respect of common defense, security and defense policy. Is the EU ready for that? It's a huge test. I'm happy to hear that declaration. However, now we are facing a true test of EU determination. If it fulfills its obligations. But getting back to the question, there is a huge potential to change the powers distribution in the EU. Pity we are wasting the opportunity. Tim, referring to Rafał's words, let's leave Polish policy behind, but consider the lessons we can learn from the crisis, from war, for EU, for the world. Because it is that we say many positive words about the European Union, what it did in the crisis, but we can also have a different perspective. If it wasn't for the US, our military assistance for Ukraine would be negligible. If it wasn't the US, we would feel endangered truly in Europe. At the same time, we have the ambitions of building geopolitical union. Rafał mentioned that we must invest more in defense. But is it so that the war is showing us that the illusion of geopolitical union is just illusion? That we see the reality that the US is the only serious player and we are lagging behind? Or is the conclusion that there is no alternative? Perhaps the US in a couple of years will no longer provide an umbrella for us and we have to do more. There is no alternative to that. However, nothing is without alternatives in politics.
Agree that potentially this is an incredible moment for Poland to have great influence inside the EU, and it's being completely wasted. It also illustrates something important, which is Sylvie talked about contradictions. The consequences of these multiple challenges sometimes cancel each other out or are in tension with each other. For example, I think it's really important, particularly just having come from Hungary, that the EU keeps up the conditionality, the linkage between EU funds and rule of law, democracy, media pluralism. But it's quite clear to me that actually that's going to weaken because of the context of the Ukrainian war, I'm afraid, in relation to Poland and Hungary. Point number one. Point number two, and Sylvie mentioned arms supplies. You know, it is absurd that we're messing around because all our militaries have different and often not interoperable equipment, so that our arms supplies to Ukraine are in many ways fantastically incoherent. So clearly we should be doing much more military integration, which means integration of our defense industry, which is extremely different for states because they don't like giving up their control of their defense industries. But, so we need to get tougher and more integrated. And we also need to think of ourselves in Europe as a power, right? You mentioned superstate. Tony Blair had a line which I still think is pretty good. We don't want a superstate, but we want a superpower. And I still believe that should be our aspiration. L'Europe puissance, to be a really powerful Europe. But to your question, the notion that we are actually going to get to anything that could meaningfully be called strategic autonomy in the next 2 years before the 2024 election in the United States is for the birds. It's a complete illusion to think that we can do that. Of course, we should work in that direction, but let's be absolutely clear. For our hard security in relation to Russia and China, we're still going to need the United States. So if Donald Trump is elected in 2024, it's going to be a moment of great danger for us because we won't be that superpower by 2024. My hope is, given that the one thing on which Republicans and Democrats, or most Republicans and Democrats agree, is Ukraine, that even Donald Trump might be constrained in pulling back from NATO because of the context of the Ukraine war. Very last comment. The biggest thing the EU can do is a strategic agenda of widening and deepening. That's absolutely clear to me. If we succeed, it will be without precedent in European history. For 2,000 years, the European conundrum has been how to find the balance between unity and diversity. And we succeeded in the Holy Roman Empire, right? For quite a long time. We succeeded in Charlemagne's Europe, Carolingian Europe, which not accidentally was the original Europe of the European community. But how you do that in a European Union of 35 member states, that's something we've never done before. And so the relationship between the Carolingian core Europe and this large periphery in Eastern and Southeastern Europe is going to be a huge challenge.
No właśnie, to mnie prowadzi do dwóch pytań.
That leads me to two questions for Sylvie. Both regard France somehow. Tim mentioned that the vision of the strategic Europe or autonomous strategy of the European Union, or the European Union that is a coherent, independent actor on the international arena, is unrealistic now. I feel it is not exactly the Paris approach. Could you comment on that? And secondly, the idea of the European political community, a summit that happened last week in Prague, when they established, it's not an institution, a summit of 44 states, European states, of similar thinking about international law, condemning Russian aggression. That was the idea of Emmanuel Macron to create a collaboration forum with the states that aspire to be EU members. How this idea relates to the geopolitical Europe idea, to what Tim just said? What's behind it? Are we going to have two-speed union? Where does this idea take us?
But I can explain the context. We don't know where we're going to actually in all this context, in all this situation today. First, regarding strategic autonomy, of course, Macron hasn't given up on his dream, and he even thinks that this is a new opportunity for it. That, as you said, I mean, it's not only 2024 who we might have a completely different president in the White House, but already in the midterm elections in a few weeks' time, a couple of weeks, in early November, you know, we might have a more complicated situation in Washington, D.C. So it is ironic that we are, of course we are. The security situation and this war would be completely different if it were not for the US. Definitely, I think the US is providing alone more than all the European states together. So that gives you an idea of how important and existential it is. And we are not ready to substitute this power, of course. But, I mean, if we don't start now, when are we going to start? I mean, you know, it will always be too late. So I think this is a very strong argument, what's happening now, for pushing, you know, European autonomy. This word of autonomy, of course, is not very popular. Maybe sovereignty is better, or capacity to act, or whatever you call it. But I think it is also in the interest of the United States to have a stronger Europe, which has more capacity to defend itself. So, and at the moment, the European defense industry is not progressing, because all this money which is being spent is spent mostly on the American industry. So no, I think this effort should go on, and I think it has been progressing over the past few years, and I think France, my bet is that France will keep pushing it. About this 44 meeting in Prague, you know, nobody, when Macron suggested this idea in May, nobody including in France, nobody took it really seriously. We all thought in Europe and in France, everybody thought it's another, gadget or whatever. Because of the situation, I think countries outside the EU took advantage of it because there was a need to show also that Europe as a whole, beyond the European Union, had to show Russia and the rest of the world that it was a real entity driven by some common values. It's not only countries aspiring to EU membership which took part. The United Kingdom came, Liz Truss, the Prime Minister, came, which was quite a surprise, but she obviously felt that there was something to gain for her also there. And one last thing, I don't think the case was made, and that was very important, that it was not an alternative to EU membership, and I think that's what convinced aspiring countries which aspire to be EU members to come and to embrace this idea. One thing I like about this, it's not going to become another institution or another organization, but it will meet every 6 months somewhere. There will be the summit of probably 44 countries every 6 months, once in a EU country and once in a non-EU country. So next meeting will be in Moldova, which I think is great. Probably the third one will be in Spain, and the fourth one will be in the United Kingdom, which is also great, I think. And I think last thing, I think this gathering of 44 countries is another expression of what I said earlier, that Europe will not be the same. So yeah, I mean, you cannot really have a European Union the way it functions now of 36 or 40 members. So yes, there will be other dimensions, other ways of acting together.
No właśnie, to jest trochę...
What Sylvie has said, it leads us to this question mark in the title of our debate, whether the EU after the war, what will it look like? So I would like to continue with this theme because the perspective of enlargement has reached the breakthrough point, at least if we look at the political declarations concerning the position of EU candidates of such countries as Moldova and Ukraine. So it's very important to the EU. Rafał has mentioned that he's afraid that this process maybe will not be that fast, and it may actually cause some frustrations, as it has happened in the Balkans. Sylvie and Tim has said that the EU will be completely different. So let's consider what will happen when the Ukraine will join the Ukraine. How will it change the EU, and how the EU will have to change to make sure that the Balkan states and Ukraine, Moldova will be able to join the EU, to make sure that the EU remains the organization, the organism that is functioning efficiently and effectively. Of course, the problem is what kind of union will it have to be? I am very afraid of huge disappointment. Now we have some emotions concerning what is going on in Ukraine, and I would like to emphasize that it's great that the decision has been made. However, we have to ask whether the overall EU in a year or in 2 years' time will be ready to treat this proposal seriously. Building EU as a region which will develop with different speeds. Actually, it started during Mitterrand's government. Now we need flexibility. Some countries can integrate more closely in specific areas, and of course everyone else will be able to participate. Schengen is an example. We've got an agreement that we can share data on DNA. Of course, not all member states have consented. Not all marriages are recognized, and that's fine. if we are going to develop completely separate institutions, when there will be a government in France that will have a completely different ideas on different separate institutions, this will be a problem. We will have a big fragmentation. So, for example, Bosnia citizens and other countries, they do not want to be members of the European Union of slow speed. Everybody wants to be a member state of the Union which has high speed. Maybe we have made a mistake. Many of my friends say, well, you have cheated. You see, this is the way Poland is. You have promised a different Poland, and this is absurd. So it can actually lead to the situation that the EU will fall apart, especially if we maintain to have populist governments. So there is a huge danger that we will disappoint these great hopes, expectations. If the EU is going to work, if Ukraine and Moldova are going to become member states, then the EU will have to be stronger when we consider foreign and defense-related policy. Of course, these countries have to be member states in NATO. EU has to cooperate with NATO, and the budget of the EU will have to be completely different, because integrating Ukraine with the EU will cost hundreds of millions of euros. So the current budget is insufficient. This would mean that the cohesion policy, agricultural policy will have to be closed down if Ukraine would join. So these are the true questions we have to answer, and the EU has to answer these questions, and I'm afraid about the next 3 months, not a decade or 15 years. I am worried whether the EU will be able to cope with the energy crisis nowadays. We have 4 minutes to go, and I would like to ask each one of you a question not what will happen in a decade, but what will happen in next 3 months, and in your opinion, what are your greatest fears and hopes for the next 3 months? We were talking about different threats of populism, anti-European attitudes. What can happen? What can provide an impulse to strengthen? And what can weaken us? Tim, 1 minute.
One word. I think we all agree that we need more European power. When you start talking about autonomy, you hear the voice of Charles de Gaulle, Europe versus the United States. That divides us. But European power we need. Obviously, the winter is going to be very tough. Having a post-neo-fascist head of government in the third largest economy in the EU and a founding state of the EU is a real challenge. I think the guy who might come to our rescue is actually called Vladimir Putin, in the sense that every time one feels that the unity of the European Union is beginning to crumble, he does something so atrocious, lands a cruise missile on a children's playground, or the German consulate in Kiev, very good move that he pulls us together again. So I'm actually cautiously optimistic that we will get through this winter, but our title is unbelievably optimistic. After the war. What do you mean after the war? We're right in the middle of this war. It could go on for a very long time. It could get worse. So the biggest challenge we have is to get to after the war.
Oui?
Yeah, I agree. And also that the peace may be even more difficult to manage than the war, because, you know, what happens, my hope is that we don't get divided again about how to manage Russia after the war. But this is not for the next 3 months. That's for much later. And the next 3 months, my fear is that public opinion, you know, because of the price rises and the energy prices, and that people in Western Europe particularly get really tired. My hope is that I don't see it happening right now. And it is true that prices are really high for a lot of people and life is becoming more difficult. But at least in France, for instance, I don't see the support for Ukraine going down. And people are still it's still very much a big issue and people are still very motivated. So this is my hope that we can hold it.
Rafał, ostatnie słowo.
And Rafał, the last word is for you. I agree with Tim. The title is very optimistic because if the war is over, what will happen with Russia next? Russia will be unstable. It will be probably in a huge crisis, and we will have to respond to this crisis. And if the EU becomes democratic, actually, if Russia becomes democratic, EU will have to help. So we hope that there will not be authoritarianism. It will not develop. The next 3 months will be like a test, whether we will maintain the unity, whether we keep the heart standing. Tough standing for the overall democracy and for the transatlantic treaty. Every crazy man in the world is watching what is going on in the European Union, and if the European Union is durable and maintains its position, there is a high chance that the world will be more stable. If the EU fails this test, then the conflicts, there will be more conflicts than the conflicts that it's close to us. Thank you very much. The time is up. I hope it wasn't the time we have lost, so thank you very much for a great discussion. The next debate, which will take place after our debate, is called "Do Not Believe in Anything That Will Be Said During Tonight's Debates." I hope that it does not refer to our debate. We have discussed many topics which, luckily or unluckily, will keep their validity, not throughout the next 3 months, but for longer. So thank you very much for your participation. I would like to thank Sylvie Kauffmann, Tim and Rafał Trzaskowski. Timothy Garton Ash will sign his book in the foyer, published by Cultura Liberalna. So if anyone would like to get the book signed, this is a good opportunity. So thank you very much for your attention and have a nice evening.